Salve. So I've received quite a few comments on my last video asking me how I can be a traditionalist and a Protestant, that presumably the Catholics and Orthodox asking me this believe that the two are contradictory ideas, and the confusion over the apparent paradox that is me is understandable. It seems traditionalism is very palatable and immediately compatible for a conservative Catholic or Orthodox Christian. It seems to be just a reiteration of what they already believe in. They have a clear moral framework, metaphysics, a well-established line of tradition, and I think something I neglected to mention in my first episode, a culture. And so as traditionalism attracts a much higher proportion of Catholics, I guess what I'm being asked here is to explain myself, and I hope in this video I will be able to do that. So it would seem that, at least from the perspective of the inquisitive Catholic viewer, that me having to reconcile my rejection of modernity and my Protestant faith is about to get even more difficult because not only am I a Protestant, but I am an evangelical. And on top of that, I left my more or less traditional Presbyterian church several months ago for an evangelical Baptist one. And when I say evangelical, I mean everyone is dressed casually, the congregation and pastors alike. The worship service is completely contemporary, with the worship music feeling like a concert and the sermon feeling a bit like a motivational speech, and though the building itself is actually quite old, it is about as modern a church as you could possibly find, save for the theology. And so it seems that I am standing in a contradiction. How on earth can I be someone who has a strong affinity for the past, who believes that tradition matters, and who has a low tolerance for modernity, feel comfortable worshiping to pop rock Christian music? And the simple answer is that while I do find some contradiction, I believe that focusing on the tradition, ritual, and culture first is putting the cart before the horse. If we are going to hold me to my own definition of traditionalism, you'll recall that traditionalism doesn't start with Gregorian chants, centuries-old stone statues, and speaking in Latin. It starts with morality. The reason behind all the tradition, the reason why you value tradition, or at least why you should, is the meaning behind all the symbols. If you want a traditional society, you have to start with belief in an objective moral law, and ultimately an architect behind that law. I think that focusing on an attractive culture first, and not the deeper moral truths, is a recipe for disaster. I've heard from a lot of people, particularly on the alt-right, that what essentially they want is a Christian culture and a Christian ethic, but they don't want to believe in the underlying theology that holds it all together. They'll want to be gallivanting down the street dressed as a crusader screaming Deus Vult at everyone, but I doubt a lot of them will be interested in actually coming to know Christ. Now, none of this is to say that I don't think tradition is important. Again, as I stated in my first video, I view tradition as the mechanism to carry on moral truths, and as a way of expressing those moral truths. I just think that we need to start with the morality. What good is all the tradition and symbols if no one actually understands what they mean, or even cares? In a way, it reminds me of the anime Evangelion, which is chock full of Christian symbolism, but there's no real substance behind it. And this is essentially what evangelicals refer to when we speak about the difference between religion and a relationship with Jesus. It's not that we actually have anything against ritual or traditions. What we're expressing is a criticism of those rituals and traditions when they become empty of any actual faith. And this brings me to some phenomena that I think can help illustrate my point and bring this back to Protestantism. I think anyone who is at least somewhat familiar with the social and religious landscape of America can recognize almost immediately the phenomenon known as the cultural Catholic or the nominal Catholic. These individuals usually come from historically Catholic backgrounds like Irish or Italian or Hispanic. Pretty much everyone they know or in their family is and was Catholic, and it's an intimate part of their upbringing and culture and community. Now, these people's actual faith can range from almost non-existent to genuine belief, but what I think defines a cultural Catholic is that to them, being Catholic is more cultural than spiritual. And as they get older and move out, they will want to keep the identity as a Catholic, but will never go to church, and even if they do, they more or less don't believe in any of the church's teachings. They see no issue having premarital sex using birth control all the time, they'll be pro-choice, and they'll be in favor of gay marriage, and despite all of these being directly against explicit teachings of the Catholic Church, they still call themselves Catholic. Now, I'm not here to criticize or chastise the Catholic Church because cultural Protestants absolutely exist, and in some ways they're almost worse because of how insufferable they can be. And I know because several of them are members of my family. In this case, they are usually of English, German, or Dutch heritage, are typically wealthier and more educated, and nowadays older. And I would say for a lot of cultural Protestants, especially in the Northeast, the church essentially functions as a social club and a platform to assert how involved you are with the community. In this case, the congregation views the church in terms of how it benefits them socially. And of course, these people tend to completely reject any historic and biblical teachings on essentially everything. Rainbow flags fly above the door of some centuries-old church in New England. Inside the building is almost completely empty, save for a few dozen socialite baby boomers and 80-something-year-old grandmothers who attended the church since they were little. The sermon is some watered-down message with no actual spiritual weight to it, and what most people actually look forward to is meeting and gossiping with other people after the service. Okay, so I may have been painting with too fine a brush here, but I think you get the point. That in both cases, the culture, tradition, and communal aspects of the church are omnipresent, but absent is what actually matters. And let's contrast this with the people who actually believe. Catholic converts, at least the numerous ones I've talked to, tend to be the most devout believers in the church I've ever seen. They seem to have a knowledge of Catholic theology and the inner workings and politics of the church that would even put some priests to shame. And yet they did not grow up in the church. They have no Catholic culture, no tradition in their family, and no real connection to the church outside of either faith itself or the love they were shown by certain Catholics that brought them to the church. And then you have born-again evangelical Christians who, again, while they may have grown up in a nominally Christian household, the church, its culture, and traditions were either not present or they were never actually explained. And now they go to churches which often have very little in the way of tradition and ritual. I mean, the churches themselves are often only a decade or so old, and yet these people are, again, incredibly devout believers and hold their Christian faith as the most important aspect of their lives. And as someone who goes to an evangelical church, I can say we don't really have cultural Christians. We either have genuine practicing believers or non-believers interested in becoming Christians. So the reason I'm saying all this is that, from my perspective, and the perspective of, I think, a lot of evangelical Christians, is that we've come to the conclusion that putting the tradition and culture first has not only been ineffective at conveying the Christian faith to a very large amount of people, but that the church has been actively harmed by it, because churches become filled with individuals who only value it for its cultural and social significance, and not as a place to worship God. And I think that the Catholic singer Audrey Assad phrased it excellently when she said, "It's really starting to hit home to me that many Christians see the church as more of a country club than a hospital." So in the end, where does this leave us? I mean, I think I've done the best I can in arguing that you can, in fact, be a Protestant and a Traditionalist. That while I absolutely agree that tradition is important, I believe that morality and metaphysics come first, and should always come first. And although you may disagree with them on theology, I maintain that despite all our problems, despite the Joel Osteens and the megachurches and the televangelists and the pure flicks, we understand that the gospel comes first. And so I guess from where I'm standing, my advice to Christians of every stripe is this, that as sweet and appealing as the fruit of tradition may be, churches need to feed people with the bread of the gospel first. Diabana.
Wir wollen unseren alten Kaiser Wilhelm wieder. Wir wollen unseren alten Kaiser Wilhelm wieder. Aber den mit dem Bart, mit dem langen Bart. Aber den mit dem Bart, mit dem langen Bart. So schwärmten unsere Eltern von der guten alten Zeit. Sie liegt so fern und weit, die alte Kaiserzeit. Doch war sie wirklich besser, diese gute alte Zeit, als einst der Opa, die Oma hat wohl gefeit. Ja, mit Jagdgesang und mit Hörnerklang, rings umher Berlin, durch die Wälder ziehen. Ja, mit Jagdgesang und mit Hörnerklang, ritt die Oma mit dem Opa. Doch sie hielten an und küssten sich, sonst wären wir